Here is the thing about Orion Pictures that almost nobody talks about. In March 1992, The Silence of the Lambs swept all 5 major Academy Awards, taking Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay in a clean run, so rare it had only happened twice before in Oscar history. The cast collected their statues. The speeches were emotional. The applause was genuine. The studio behind it was bankrupt. Orion Pictures had filed for Chapter 11 protection 3 months earlier, in December 1991, buried under $690 million in debt, with executives in reorganization meetings and films sitting on a shelf gathering dust. And yet there it was, collecting Hollywood's highest honors, while the lawyers argued over the furniture. That is not a metaphor. That is what actually happened. There is something genuinely extraordinary about that, not just as an irony, but as a story worth understanding properly, because Orion was not some fly-by-night operation that stumbled into one successful film. It was founded by people who had already run one of the most respected studios in Hollywood, and it produced The Terminator, RoboCop, Amadeus, Platoon, Dances with Wolves, and The Silence of the Lambs. 4 Best Picture winners, more than any comparable studio of its era, and it still collapsed. The question worth sitting with is not simply what went wrong. It is how a studio that talented fell apart so completely, and what the decisions behind those productions, those vehicles, and those franchise opportunities actually reveal about how Hollywood functions when the cameras stop rolling. The story opens at United Artists in January 1978, which means it opens with frustration. Arthur B. Krim, Eric Pleskow, and Robert S. Benjamin held senior positions at United Artists, a studio with genuine creative credibility and a track record of working with serious directors on serious films. The problem was Transamerica, the conglomerate that owned the studio and managed it accordingly, treating a creative enterprise like a quarterly earnings report. Krim, Pleskow, and Benjamin were done with it. So they walked. They took 2 other executives with them, founded a new company, and named it after a constellation, claiming it represented 5 stars. Orion actually has 7 or 8, depending on how you count, and I find that detail quietly telling about the gap between the mythology these men preferred and the arithmetic sitting underneath it. Distribution ran through Warner Brothers in the early years, and the first film to carry the Orion name reached cinemas in April 1979, a modest picture called A Little Romance. Not a blockbuster. The ambition, though, was clear from the beginning. This would be a studio built for directors rather than corporations. What followed was genuinely impressive in creative terms. Woody Allen arrived, Oliver Stone arrived, Jonathan Demme arrived, James Cameron brought The Terminator to Orion in 1984, a film produced on a reported budget of around $6 million, which was already lean, and it returned many times that figure at the box office. The 1984 Pontiac Trans Am featured in that film as the Terminator's primary vehicle became one of the decade's more iconic production cars, a blacked-out machine whose cold mechanical presence suited the character almost too precisely to be accidental. Here's the thing, though. Of the 23 films Orion released between April 1979 and December 1981, only a third turned a profit. That is not a studio finding its footing. That is a structural problem announcing itself early and being filed away rather than addressed. By the mid-1980s, Orion had found a genuine identity, producing films with cultural weight and a roster of directors who trusted the studio precisely because it seemed to trust them. And then, Metro Media entered the picture. John Klug, the Metro Media owner, took a minor stake in 1986 and bought 67% of the company by May 1988. The cash injections kept the operation running, but the arrangement altered the dynamics at a company that had prided itself on functioning like an artists' collective with executives who actually watched movies. By the end of July 1991, Orion's long-term debt stood at $511 million, with total obligations potentially higher, though figures from that period carry enough inconsistency across sources that the precise number is worth treating carefully. What is not in question is the scale of the burden. The films being produced during this stretch, meanwhile, included some of the best work the studio ever released. RoboCop arrived in 1987 on a production budget of approximately $13 million, excluding marketing costs, and its visual identity is almost impossible to separate from its vehicles. The 1986 Ford Taurus LX carried the role of the Detroit Metro West Police Department patrol car, chosen specifically because its aerodynamic, forward-leaning styling felt genuinely futuristic, despite already sitting on dealer forecourts across America. The original production plan apparently involved a custom police vehicle with elaborate interior display technology, but the budget reality of the shoot ended that conversation quickly, and what replaced it was arguably smarter. A real production car with a modified interior felt more plausible, more grounded, and considerably more threatening than a purpose-built prop would have been. The villain's vehicle, the fictitious 6000 SUX, operated on a completely different register. Built on an Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme platform and modified by customizer Gene Winfield, the production put two functional versions of the car on screen, with a third non-functional shell reserved for the destruction sequence. The 6000 SUX was a deliberate piece of automotive satire, wide and chrome-heavy, and designed to look like every bad decision the American car industry made in the late 1970s, compressed into a single object. These were not productions cutting corners or chasing easy returns. The vehicles chosen for them reflected deliberate creative thinking about what the future looked and felt like on screen, and the craft behind those decisions is evident in how long the images have lasted. The debt, unlike the craft, kept growing regardless. By 1990, Orion ranked last in revenue among major Hollywood studios, a position that should have triggered a serious structural response. What it produced instead was a form of institutional hope, because Dances with Wolves was on its way. Kevin Costner's three-hour Western reached cinemas in late 1990 and pulled in well over $100 million domestically, with worldwide grosses reported around $400 million, though domestic and worldwide figures have been quoted inconsistently enough across sources to warrant some caution. The Silence of the Lambs followed in early 1991, adding another $130 million domestically in nominal, unadjusted figures. Back-to-back, those two films represented a genuine cultural moment for the studio. None of it was enough because $690 million in debt does not respond to award season. There is one decision from this period I keep returning to. Before the financial situation reached its endpoint, Orion had invested in the Addams family. When the cash pressure became acute, the studio sold the rights to Paramount for $14.6 million, recovering exactly what it had put in and nothing more. Paramount released the film and took $113 million domestically in 1991, all figures nominal and unadjusted for inflation. Orion, starved for revenue, had handed a competitor one of the biggest hits of the year at cost price, with no upside retained. The studio had also, earlier in its history, reportedly passed on Raiders of the Lost Ark, while conflicted about committing to large-budget productions. That pattern of stepping back precisely when a project was about to break wide open is not bad luck in isolation. Repeated across years and multiple opportunities, it starts to read as a recurring institutional instinct. In December 1991, Orion filed for Chapter 11 protection. Eric Pleskow resigned the following July, telling the New York Times there was little for me to do at this point, which is the kind of exit statement that lands harder the longer you sit with it. An anonymous executive described what was being discussed internally as tantamount to liquidation. The films on the shelf stayed there. The creative relationships that had defined the studio dissolved. The company built explicitly as an alternative to corporate filmmaking now existed entirely at the discretion of its creditors. And then March 1992 arrived. The Silence of the Lambs had reached cinemas in February 1991, before the bankruptcy filing. By the night it swept the Oscars 11 months later, Orion was deep inside Chapter 11, and the 5 awards were collected on behalf of a studio being restructured in a different room of the same building. Billy Crystal had addressed it from the stage at the previous year's ceremony, observing that Dances with Wolves had been released by Orion, a studio in a coma. The joke worked because it was accurate, and Hollywood humor tends to be sharpest when it is also the least kind. Orion emerged from bankruptcy in November 1992 with $72 million earmarked for prints and advertising on the 10 films that had been held back, covering marketing costs only and separate from production budgets entirely. Several of those films had absorbed real damage from the delay. RoboCop 3 carried a production budget of approximately $23 million, but the shelf time and the loss of Peter Weller, who chose not to return for the third film, stripped something out of it that no release strategy could replace. The franchise that had been one of Orion's genuinely original contributions to American cinema closed out with a film that felt like a studio, cutting its losses and hoping nobody noticed. Car 54, Where Are You?, grossed just over $1.2 million against a $10 million production budget in 1994, and that number honestly deserves a moment of quiet acknowledgement. The easy version of the Orion story attributes the collapse to a run of bad films in the early 1990s, and that reading is partially correct. What it misses is that the debt load destroying the company had been accumulating for over a decade before those films arrived. The studio made excellent creative decisions and catastrophic financial ones in parallel, year after year, and at some point the arithmetic simply caught up. The slow response to home video revenue is worth noting here as well. At a moment when the home video market was reshaping the economics of the entire industry, Orion held back, missing a revenue stream that could have provided meaningful relief against obligations that were already compounding. MGM absorbed the Orion library in 1997, and the films survived even as the brand went into extended storage. A genuine revival came in 2017 when MGM relaunched Orion Pictures as a standalone distribution label with a specific mandate around films from underrepresented filmmakers. Not a logo licensing arrangement, but a functioning operation with its own creative direction. Following Amazon's acquisition of MGM, which closed in 2022, Orion earned 3 consecutive Best Picture Academy Award nominations: Women Talking in 2022, American Fiction in 2023, and Nickel Boys in 2024. A studio once synonymous with Chapter 11 proceedings now operates under the most financially robust entertainment structure on Earth, and its output is back in the conversation that matters most. The physical artifacts from the original era are scattered and largely unaccounted for. One of the 1986 Ford Taurus LX sedans modified for the RoboCop production was last reported on display at the Branson Auto Museum in Missouri, though the current status of that vehicle remains unconfirmed. Production vehicles from the Terminator and the broader Orion library have not surfaced recently at major auction houses with verified documentation, which means the cars that help define what the screen version of the future looked like during the 1980s are, for the most part, simply missing from the record. There is something fitting about that absence. Orion Pictures was a studio whose most lasting contributions are embedded throughout the culture and almost nowhere in the official archive. The Terminator reshaped science fiction cinema. RoboCop altered how studios thought about franchise construction and world building. The Silence of the Lambs expanded what the Academy was willing to recognize and reward. The studio responsible for all of it filed for bankruptcy while holding 5 Oscars, which is either the most Hollywood ending imaginable, or a genuinely instructive lesson about the difference between making great work and running a sustainable operation. Creative excellence and financial discipline are not the same skill. Orion had one of them in extraordinary abundance, and the other one finished them. The gap between what Orion produced and what its balance sheet looked like tells you more about how Hollywood actually functions than almost any other story from that era, and it is exactly the kind of territory this channel keeps digging into.